Altova FlowForce Server is a tool for the automated execution of XML and XBRL processing tasks, data mappings, and data transformations. In this video, we'll show how MapForce and FlowForce Server work together to automate data integration and transformation workflows. FlowForce Server accepts client requests and then calls MapForce Server to execute deployed mappings and generate output files. For this demo, we assume that MapForce and FlowForce Server have already been installed and configured on a machine in your environment. That server could be an on-premises physical server, a virtual machine running on your preferred hypervisor, or a cloud-based deployment depending on your requirements. Let's take a quick look at some system-wide options in the admin interface. This page allows you to configure the SMTP server settings for sending email notifications, and you can easily test the settings. You can also configure logging to control the size of log entries and their severity levels. With this overview in mind, we will next look at how mappings are deployed to FlowForce Server and executed as part of an automated workflow. Our demo company receives a large number of purchase orders from US and EU customers. Since tax calculations differ between the regions, we have created two mappings. Each mapping processes multiple Excel files and transforms them into multiple JSON files. Each Excel file consists of two sheets. The first one contains customer data, such as the address and order number. The second one provides information about the ordered line items. Let's take a quick look at the output. And here's the US mapping. Let's also check its output. So how do we decide which mapping to execute? For this purpose, we have another mapping that will be used for conditional processing in FlowForce Server. The mapping uses the same Excel component, but in this case it receives input files via the simple input component. When an order arrives, the component passes the country code from the file to the value map. Since we have several European countries, we use the value map to convert any European country codes to EU, and the US stays the same. The mapping passes this value to the simple output component, and this output is then used in the FlowForce job. Let's deploy all these mappings to FlowForce Server. The mapping will be deployed to the following server container. You can also select this checkbox, and after you click the OK button, a new browser window with the deployed mapping will open, and you will be able to proceed with job configuration. In our case, we will access the deployed mappings a bit later. The deployment is successful. Let's deploy the other two mappings as well. All our mappings are deployed to FlowForce Server, and now it's time to configure our job. In short, this is what the job will achieve. When the incoming folder receives a new purchase order, the job will run the conditional mapping that outputs the name of the region. If the mapping returns US, the job will execute the US mapping. Otherwise, the job will execute the EU mapping. On success, the source and target files will be moved to the processed folder. On error, the faulty source and target files will land in the failed folder. First of all, let's add a file system trigger. This trigger type starts a job when a change is detected in a file or folder. For example, a new file has been added. Also, we need to supply the directory that will be monitored. As soon as we set the file system trigger, a trigger file input parameter is automatically added at the top of the page. It is a runtime parameter that contains the full path of the file that triggered the execution of the job. For example, an Excel file dropped into the incoming folder. We will use this parameter in later steps. There is another parameter that we need to set. Let's call it WD. The default value is the path base of the working directory. With these parameter, paths will be shorter and much easier to handle in subsequent steps. Now let's work on the steps that define what our job should do. First, we need to add an execution step that will run the conditional mapping. Let's click on the drop-down list and select this mapping. Then we set the input parameter to the trigger file. Since the trigger file contains the full path, we do not need to set the working directory. Mapping steps can return output files or standard output for simple results such as strings. In our case, only standard output is returned, and to access it, we first assign the steps result to a variable called result. Later steps expect a region value as a string, so we need to extract the standard output as a stream and then convert it to a string. For this purpose, we need an execution step with the system function compute. Then we use the following expression. After that, we assign the steps result to a variable called region. We will use the region in later steps. We also need a step to compute the base name of our future output files. For this, we use the compute string system function. And this is how we construct the base name. In FlowForce expression language, we must enclose the text in curly braces for it to be interpreted as an expression in a string field. The instance ID function outputs the job's unique instance ID. The filename function extracts the name of the trigger file without its extension. As a result, the name may look like this. Let's also assign the step result to a value called output base. Now let's work on the block that will process the main mappings. For this purpose, we need an error success handling step. It consists of protected steps, also known as the main sequence, and error success handlers. Depending on whether the protected steps succeed or fail, the relevant handler block is executed. The purpose of the error success handling block is to ensure the execution of error handling and cleanup steps even if the main sequence fails. So let's get back to the job configuration page and add this step. Next, we define a choose step, which is the main sequence in our scenario. In the when field, we enter the following expression. After that, we need an execution step that will run the US mapping. By default, source files are relative to the mapping. Our Excel files, which trigger job execution, come from a different location. So let's set this parameter to the trigger file. In the otherwise part, we add an execution step that will run the EU mapping. If the value of the region is US, the job will execute the US mapping. Otherwise, the job will run the EU mapping. Let's proceed with the handlers. We will start with the onSuccess handler. OnSuccess, we want the job to move the source and target files to the processed folder. For this purpose, we add an execution step with the move function. Then we set the source parameter to the trigger file. And the target location is as follows. As you can see, we use the region and output base variables we defined previously. Next, we need to set the working directory to the input parameter we defined at the top of the page. Only the output location is relative to the working directory because the trigger file contains the full path. Let's define a similar step for output files. We construct the source and target paths dynamically, and both of them are relative to the working directory. Next, we configure the onError handler. We need almost the same execution steps with the move functions. If an error is encountered, the faulty source and target files will be moved to the failed folder. If an error occurs, we do not want the job to fail, but instead continue running. Therefore, we will add a resume step. Next, we must specify a result expression. Let's use the following. The resume step is placed inside a handler block and allows the job to continue running even after an error has occurred. When the resume step is executed, FlowForce Server exits a protected block, replaces the block's result with a computed result expression, and continues job execution as if the block had completed successfully. Before we can test the job, we need to supply the relevant credentials. You can type them in manually or define them as a standalone object. We will select the credential object we created earlier. And let's not forget to save the job configuration. Let's drop some files into the incoming folder and observe the process. The job has successfully processed all the files. Let's check some other output folders. Now that we've seen how an automation scenario works, let's take a closer look at some other capabilities of FlowForce Server. We have already dealt with most of the step types except for these two. For each steps lets you iterate over a sequence such as a list of files in a folder and repeat one or more steps for each item in that sequence. Postpone steps run after all other non-postpone steps have completed. This ensures the postpone steps execute only when their prerequisites are ready, reducing errors and making your workflow more reliable. The execution result of a job is a detailed record of the job's outcome. Declaring the return type is necessary if you want to cache the job result or process it in another job. FlowForce Server can cache the results of time-consuming jobs. When such a job is exposed as a web service, cached results are returned instantly, improving performance. This is especially useful for jobs that process large datasets, run complex database queries, or call external services with unpredictable response times. Triggers determine when a job runs. Time-based triggers are used for scheduling jobs to run at specific times or intervals. File system triggers execute a job when files are created or modified. HTTP triggers allow you to monitor a URI for changes. FlowForce Server can expose jobs as HTTP web services. This allows external systems, applications, or authorized users to execute a job on demand by making a GET or POST request to the specified service URL. Queues provide a flexible mechanism to manage server load both on a single machine and in a cluster. Together, all these features give FlowForce Server the ability to run complex workflows automatically, interact with other systems, and handle errors in a controlled way. To find out more about FlowForce Server, please visit our website.